Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an event that literally reshaped the globe, the fall of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan in 1521. But look, we're not going to tell that old grade school story. You know the one. Instead, we're framing the fall of Tenochtitlan not as some miraculous European conquest or a tiny band of Spaniards magically toppled an empire, but as what it actually was: a massive indigenous civil war and a brilliant, utterly brutal strategic chess match. To really grasp the strategy here, we first have to shatter a deeply ingrained fable. Fast forward for a second to 1603. A Spanish commander named Luis Piroz des Marinas was facing a Chinese uprising in Manila. He bought into that heroic myth, the idea that a handful of Europeans were just inherently superior to any indigenous force. And he rallied his troops by declaring, "Keep going, for 25 soldiers are enough for all of China." Well, buying into that fictionalized history cost him dearly. He and his men were quickly overwhelmed and crushed. That myth of European invincibility, it was fatal.
200,000. Let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering estimated number of indigenous allies that the Spanish commander Hernán Cortés actually relied upon to besiege the city. He absolutely did not act alone. Instead, he capitalized on deep-seated local resentments to build a massive army. So the reality on the ground was a far cry from the myth of the lone conqueror. The invading force did include roughly 900 to 1,300 Spanish soldiers, plus a few dozen cavalrymen. But the overwhelming bulk of the army, up to 200,000 warriors, came from native city-states like Tlaxcala and Texcoco. They were fighting right alongside the Spanish, against the mighty Aztec Empire, who fielded their own force of around 80,000 warriors. We're looking at a massive coalition here, definitely not a lone European venture. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the island fortress, then the invader strategy, followed by the defender's tactics. We'll then look at the 75-day siege and wrap up with the fall and its legacy. This is going to give us a really clear view of the tactics behind one of history's most devastating sieges. Section 1. The island fortress. You really can't understand this siege without understanding the board they were playing on. Tenochtitlan was a total marvel. It was this imposing metropolis built right smack in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico. The city heavily utilized chinampas, which were these vast floating agricultural gardens. Imagine the sheer logistical marvel of a city that's entirely self-sufficient on man-made floating islands, churning out enough food to support up to 200,000 people. It's an incredible closed system. But from a strategic perspective, relying entirely on a closed geographic system for your vital supply chain, well, that makes you a prime target for starvation. Adding to that, the city was only connected to the mainland by these narrow, elevated stone causeways featuring wooden drawbridges. So the absolute crucial point here is that whoever controlled these narrow strips of land and the water surrounding them would ultimately dictate the fate of the entire city. A pure land assault would be an absolute logistical nightmare. Moving on to Section 2, the invaders' naval strategy. Cortés and his massive indigenous coalition had actually occupied the city previously, but were driven out in a really bloody retreat known as La Noche Triste. Gearing up for a return, he realized a standard land assault was just going to fail. He needed naval supremacy. Cortés knew a land war was basically suicide, so he rolled out a highly methodical three-part plan to choke Tenochtitlan. Step 1. Cut off the city's freshwater supply by disconnecting the Aztec aqueduct at Chapultepec. Step 2, march ground troops up the causeways to block the flow of food. And Step 3, and this was the real game changer, deploy 13 custom-built, shallow draft sailing ships called brigantines. These things were built in Allied territory, totally dismantled, carried over the mountains by thousands of porters, and then reassembled right on the lake. They effectively neutralized the Aztec canoes and gave the invaders total control of the water. Which brings us to Section 3, the defenders' urban tactics. We have to look at the newly crowned Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc and the highly capable defenders trapped inside. They definitely weren't passive victims. They were military veterans actively adapting to a massive threat. This was a clash of entirely different military doctrines. The Spanish brought heavy-hitting advantages to the table: their brigantines, artillery cannons, steel weapons, and lots of European siegecraft experience. But the Aztecs? They initially had significant defensive counters tailored perfectly for asymmetric urban warfare. They had a massive fleet of fast, highly maneuverable war canoes, fierce urban guerrilla tactics, and a really deep, intimate knowledge of the lake's geography.
In fact, that urban aquatic environment initially rendered the dreaded Spanish cavalry practically useless. And the Aztecs deployed a series of seriously ingenious, lethal countermeasures. They drove concealed wooden stakes deep into the lake bed, specifically to impale the Spanish brigantines. They dug deep pits in the shallow waters so waiting invaders would just suddenly plunge underwater. They removed the wooden bridges along the causeways, forcing the attackers into deadly choke points. And they leaned heavily into visceral psychological warfare. They sacrificed captured soldiers high atop the pyramid temples, right in plain sight of the invading camps. It was a calculated move designed to completely terrify the Spanish and deter their indigenous allies. Section 4, the brutal 75-day siege. Despite that brilliant defense we just talked about, the strategic noose tightened, leading us directly into the agonizing climax of this conflict. The conflict rapidly escalated over the summer of 1521. In May, the water was cut. By June, vicious battles were raging on the causeways and out on the open lake. As the blockade held, starvation really started to set in. By July, the fighting shifted off the causeways and right into the city itself, turning into desperate, grueling, hand-to-hand urban street warfare. Finally, starved and exhausted, the city officially surrendered on August 13th, 1521. The combat inside the city was nothing short of terrifying. Because the dense urban canals heavily favored the Aztec defenders, Cortés had to adapt, and he did so with a brutally destructive strategy. He systematically razed every single neighborhood he captured. He actually ordered his forces to tear down the buildings and use that rubble to fill in the canals and the gaps in the causeways. He was literally destroying the very jewel of a city he wanted to conquer, just so his artillery and cavalry could advance in formation. The human toll here was catastrophic. While the Spanish lost an estimated 860 soldiers, the native population suffered immensely. Around 20,000 allied indigenous warriors died, and an estimated 100,000 to over 200,000 Aztec warriors and civilians perished in the campaign. The sheer volume of casualties is just staggering, and the crazy part? It was compounded by a silent killer. Long before the final assault even began, a devastating smallpox epidemic swept through the trapped city. The Spanish had acquired immunity over centuries, but the indigenous population had absolutely none. Smallpox acted as this invisible, indiscriminate weapon. It decimated the Aztec leadership, including Emperor Cuauhtémoc's predecessor, and wiped out huge swaths of the population. Those who did manage to survive the illness were often just too weak from the disease and the famine to fight or even harvest food. Finally, Section 5, the fall and its legacy. When the city surrendered, it was in complete physical and cultural ruin. A Nahuatl poem composed shortly after the fall perfectly captures the devastation. Misery is pouring, misery is felt, the smoke is rising, the haze is spreading. This primary source maintains a really powerful human connection to the tragedy. This isn't just dates and tactics, it was the apocalyptic end of a vibrant world for the people living there. And the violence definitely didn't stop on August 13th. The harsh historical reality is that following the surrender, the Tlaxcalan allies exacted brutal revenge. Think about it. For a century, they had been subjected to Aztec oppression, literally forced to hand over their youth for sacrifice in flower wars. When Tenochtitlan fell, all that pent-up hatred was unleashed. Thousands of fleeing Aztec civilians were massacred by the allied indigenous forces in an outburst of violence that reportedly appalled even the Spanish commanders. So we're going to end with this question. How do we remember a history where the conquest never truly ended, but merely shape-shifted? The fall of Tenochtitlan led to centuries of environmental destruction, as the Spanish literally drained the lakes, and a deep cultural trauma that's still actively debated and felt in Mexico today. It wasn't just a simple victory of Europe over the Americas. It was a massively complex, tragic, and monumental collision of empires, alliances, and disease. Thank you for joining me in this explainer, and I hope this leaves you wanting to dive even deeper into this fascinating, pivotal moment in human history.